Hi everyone. Today we're going to prepare to write the first exam, and this informal video is going to go through the exam assignment itself and explain the details of the requirements that you need to meet. And we're also going to look at each of the questions and discuss one way that you might approach answering them. Now, the way that I discuss is only one approach you can take. There are obviously several approaches. The one that I'm recommending is not necessarily the best one. It is simply one approach that you might want to consider taking as an example. Okay? So let's look first at the requirements for the paper. You should have your exam assignment open or printed out so that you can look at it as we go through it. The first thing you'll notice at the top of the exam sheet is that you need to submit the paper to the Completed Exam 1 drop box that you will be taken to through the link on week 8, and the due date with the time, the day, and the date that the exam is due. I don't accept late papers, so make sure that you have your exam submitted by the due date and time. What you're going to do is you're going to use readings from at least 2 different cultures that we've studied in this unit. And whenever it's possible, you will also include material from the literary critics that was presented in the videos. You will choose one and only one of the questions, and you will respond to it in a 3 to 5 page paper in MLA style. You should have learned MLA style in English 101, but I will post a video that reviews how to set up MLA style in Microsoft Word, because the paper needs to be formatted and documented according to MLA guidelines, and we will also have a video that goes over that. Please note that the paper has to be 3 to 5 pages plus the works cited page. So in other words, your paper has to be 3 pages long before the works cited page. Not 2 pages long plus the works cited page, 3 pages long plus the works cited page. You can also have up to 5 pages of text before the works cited page. So in other words, the 3 to 5 pages is the page length of what you actually write. The works cited page, which as you know is the bibliography, isn't included in that 3 to 5 page limit. Okay? And then when you're finished, you're going to submit it to the drop boxes on the week 8 weekly assignment list. Whenever it's possible to include the information that the literary critics provided in the videos, you're expected to do that. And since I'm very, very, very familiar with what those critics say, I'll know when it should have been included based on the topic you chose, and when the critics didn't make a comment on the topic you chose, and therefore you don't need the information. Now, as the assignment says, you have to choose from 2 different cultures. The reason for that is because you have to keep in mind that UNLV accepts this class to fulfill both the literature requirement and the requirement for a course they have called, I think it's called something like the Freshman Experience, but it's a class on multiculturalism. If you don't write on 2 different cultures, this class doesn't meet that requirement. So except for possibly question 7, you have to choose from 2 of these different cultures. Okay? So in other words, you may choose from the non-Hebraic Mesopotamian culture, which would be the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the Hebrew culture, which would be Genesis, and the Greek culture, which would be the Iliad or Medea. Not both. The only time that you can use those 2 works, and only those 2 works, in your response is in response to question 7, which is about emotions. Okay? Otherwise, you can choose Gilgamesh and Genesis, or Gilgamesh and the Iliad, or Gilgamesh and Medea, or Genesis and the Iliad, or Genesis and Medea. And you must write on 2 of those works. Okay. Let's take a look at the questions. The first one is to discuss the characteristics of the heroes in 2 of the works we read. And you can't use both the Medea and Iliad. The Iliad and Medea. Sorry about that. Choose only one of those 2. You're going to cite specific passages from the works and also supporting materials from the videos when those are applicable. Frankly, this is a very easy question to respond to, particularly if you choose to compare the heroes in Genesis to the heroes from either the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Iliad. Because the heroes in Genesis are very, very different from the heroes in Gilgamesh and the heroes in the Iliad. They're not militaristic, right? They're domestic heroes. And so the differences between Genesis and Gilgamesh and the Iliad are very noticeable. Now, you also can talk about the similarities between Gilgamesh and the Iliad if you choose, instead of writing about Genesis. Certainly, if you work with the heroes in Genesis, there was a considerable amount of information in the video about that. Also, there was a great deal of information about the characteristics of Achilles for the Iliad. So you would definitely want to include information from the videos about that. Again, the easiest way to approach it, if you want to particularly look at the differences, are to compare the differences between the heroes in Genesis and Gilgamesh, or the differences between the heroes in Genesis and the Iliad. And another way to approach it is to compare the similarities and differences between the heroes in Gilgamesh and the Iliad. So those are the approaches that you can take. The next question asks you to discuss the characteristics of good and bad rulers from 2 of the works we read. And again, you can't use both the Iliad and the Medea here. Now, obviously for this one, you can't use Genesis because there were no rulers in Genesis. So you pretty much have to work with Gilgamesh and the Iliad. Now, in Gilgamesh, as you recall, there's only one ruler. And he starts out being a bad ruler, and he ends up being a good ruler. The majority of that information is actually contained at the very beginning of Gilgamesh, when the narrator talks about how that Gilgamesh had been a bad ruler by taking all the young men for his service and sleeping with all the young women. And then after what happens in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the quests that he goes on and so forth, he changes into a good ruler and builds the walls that protect Uruk for centuries. Okay? And then, of course, in the Iliad, you have 2 rulers, Agamemnon and Priam. And Priam and Agamemnon are very, very different. Most people would say that Agamemnon is a bad ruler and Priam is a good ruler. Okay? So you can discuss the ruler in Gilgamesh before and after as a good ruler and bad ruler, and the rulers in the Iliad with Agamemnon as the bad ruler and Priam as the good ruler. The treatment of women in the works from the 2 cultures. And again, you can't use both the Iliad and Medea, you can use one or the other. One of the things that you can note is if you use either the Iliad or Gilgamesh, is that the women don't play very much of a role in it at all. And of course, you can't cite an example for how women don't appear. However, there are women in both of them. And certainly you can comment on the fact that most of the women, and these would be human women, not the goddesses, most of the women in the Epic of Gilgamesh play very supportive roles of men. For example, the Scorpion Man's wife and Utnapishtim's wife play very, very small roles that support the men. And I know that the Scorpion Man's wife isn't given a name, and I don't believe Utnapishtim's wife is even given a name in the work. Siduri, of course, does play a role, and you might want to look at how she supports Gilgamesh's goal, or supports the goal of society by urging him to go home and get married and have children and so forth, as opposed to continuing on his quest. In the Iliad, of course, you can look at how Briseis is used, and she is more or less used. She doesn't actually say much of anything. You can look at the exchange between Hector and his wife, Andromache, and you can also look at the discussion among Hector, Paris, and Helen. The women in Genesis play a more significant role. Certainly Eve plays a significant role in the creation story. Sarah plays a significant role in terms of Abraham's quest for a son. And Rebecca plays a significant role in helping Jacob deceive his father Isaac. You might even find it worthwhile to comment on the fact that it makes sense that the women would play a more significant role in Genesis, because the stories in Genesis focus on domestic life. And in that culture, women played a more significant role in the domestic sphere that Genesis focuses on than they did in the public sphere and the militaristic sphere that both the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Iliad focus on. The next question asks you to consider the treatment of the gods and deities and their interactions with man from two different cultures, meaning that you can't use both the Iliad and Medea. Again, one of the easiest ways to approach responding to this question is to compare the god in Genesis to the gods in either the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Iliad. One of the main differences, of course, is that there is only one god in Genesis, while there are multiple gods in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Iliad. And the presentation in the video does discuss the importance of there being only one god in Genesis. One of the things to note, though, as is noted on the exam assignment page, if you work with Genesis, stick to how God is portrayed in the selections from Genesis, not how he's portrayed in the New Testament or any other part of the Old Testament. Remember that Genesis is part of the sacred document for the Hebrews. It wasn't written and doesn't serve only as a prequel to the New Testament. So regardless of what you know from other studies of the Bible that you may have worked with in your life, do not refer to God as he is presented in the New Testament. The God in Genesis is somewhat different than God in the New Testament. So confine your discussion to what Genesis says. Also, keep in mind that we are approaching this as a literary text. So you should confine what you say about Genesis to what is actually in the text, not an interpretation that has been made by any church at any time. And as I said when I presented the video, it's not that I'm saying that what people are taught in churches and so forth is wrong, not at all, or that you have to believe what's taught in this course. It is, however, the only thing that's appropriate for answering this question in the exam. The next one talks about the nature of marriage and romantic relationships in works from two cultures, meaning that you can't use both the Iliad and Medea for this question. Of course, Medea would be a good choice for one of the two works that you use, because obviously the nature of marriage and romantic relationships is a central theme of Medea. So that might be a good work to work with. Similarly, if you work with the Epic of Gilgamesh, you could look at how unimportant marriage and romance appears to be to Gilgamesh, and what the winemaker Siduri says about the importance of returning home and raising a family. The next one is similar, but it's also somewhat different. The nature and portrayal of the family would also include discussions of children and child raising. Now, obviously, since Genesis is based on domestic tales, the portrayal of the family is very important, and is, in fact, one of the major underlying themes in Genesis. So looking at the importance of family and the nature and portrayal of family in Genesis might be a good way to go. In terms of the Iliad, we do see some family relationships. Certainly there is the relationship between Hector and his wife Andromache, and there is also a consideration of the importance of family when Hector goes to visit his brother Paris and Helen. You also might want to consider Hector's importance to his father Priam, because, after all, Priam risks a great deal to retrieve Hector's body. Now, for question 7 and only question 7, you may use both the Iliad and Medea, because question 7 asks you to discuss the attitude towards emotion. As the video states, the Iliad actually is the story of the wrath of Achilles. So clearly, Achilles' emotions play a major role in the Iliad. Also, we should note that Agamemnon tells Achilles that his claiming Briseis and his treatment of Achilles were a result of his being blinded by emotions. It's also important to note that Agamemnon attributes his emotions to fate and the gods. And obviously, emotions play an important role in Medea, which is discussed in the video. The final prompt simply gives you an opportunity to come up with a topic of your own. The questions that I have put together look at specific aspects of the work, but they're far from the only aspects that might occur to a reader. And if there is something else that appealed to you that you can use to compare two of the works, that's fantastic. I'm always very interested in seeing what occurs to students that might not have occurred to me in the past. In fact, a couple of the questions that are on the exam were created after a student wrote an exam paper about that topic, and I thought that it was interesting and significant enough to add it as a selection for everyone. But if you are going to write your own essay question, it's very important that you email me and clear it with me. And pretty much anything that asks for something other than just a basic summary of the works, I pretty much go along with. But make sure that you clear the question with me before you write on it. And then at the bottom is simply a note of what I had mentioned earlier, that as to how Genesis is to be considered. Now, as I said, this video simply goes through and suggests some approaches that you might want to take in answering the questions. They aren't the only approaches you can take, and I'm not trying to limit what you can write about. I'm simply trying to make suggestions to kind of help you understand what the questions are looking at and ways that you can approach answers in case nothing has occurred to you and you don't really know how to start. That's basically all I'm trying to do here, is to give you a way to approach it if you don't know how you want to approach it yourself. If you already have an idea of how to respond to one of the questions, that's great. Okay? I'm not saying that your response is wrong, not at all. I'm just trying to help people who don't have any idea how to get started. I'm trying to give them kind of a leg up, because I know how awful it is to have to write an answer to an exam question and you just don't know where to start from. either because there are too many ways to look at it or nothing occurs to you. Because believe me, I've written so many papers in my life when I have sat there and watched that accursed cursor sit there and blink at me because I had no idea how to approach writing a paper. And I know how dreadful that feels. So I basically am offering these suggestions to try to save you from having to deal with that stress. Okay? If you have any questions at all about anything in this video, please don't hesitate a minute to email me and ask me. It's much better to ask me if the approach you're taking to an exam is correct than it is to assume that it's correct and then not do as well as you might do had you asked me. I'm here to help you and I want to help you. So please get in touch with me if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. You know, of course, that you have to email me from an account other than Canvas, right? At deborah.oakey@csn.edu. Thanks so much for studying this video. I hope it helps give you ideas of ways that you can approach the questions and helps you get started on the paper. I'm really looking forward to reading your exams and seeing what you have to say. I always find them very, very helpful. We'll talk again soon. Until then, have a good day.